You're all very welcome this evening, and on behalf of the Dean and Chapter of Bradford Cathedral, and very importantly our Eco Group, many of which are here this evening from the Cathedral, big welcome to all of you. This is our second webinar of our 4-day series of lots of different films and talks that are going on. It's our first extravaganza online, and it's our second extravaganza. So we started with a 1-day event last year. So this is really quite exciting for us. And one of the gifts of Zoom means that we are able to draw people in from a wide geographical area. And of course, none of us are using fuel to travel, so that's really, really good. I'm really delighted that both Ruth and Jemima are going to be speaking to us this evening and showing us some presentations. But before I formally introduce them, I just want to set the scenario for this evening. So quite a lot of us now are getting experienced with Zoom and using Zoom, but just in case you're not, you will see that there is a chat function at the bottom of your screen if you hover your cursor down at the bottom. And so during listening to the talks, you may wish to write some questions or comments in the chat box as we go along. After Ruth and Jemima have finished their talks, there will be a time for questions, and we'll pick up the questions in the chat box, but you can also indicate if you would like to ask a question. During the talk, so that we don't get distracted by lots of sounds, we will all need to have our microphones muted, and that means we can really listen without any unexpected noises like one of my cats jumping on the desk or something silly like that. So, and to remind you all that the session will be recorded so that you can have access to it at a later date. Now, both Ruth and Jemima are going to be talking to us about the becoming carbon neutral and what that might mean for us, particularly from the Church of England's perspective. Now, Ruth is the parish priest of St John's, Sharow, which is a silver eco church which manages its churchyard as a country wildlife. She is an area environmental champion for the Ripon Episcopal Area and author of the blog site greeningthelectionary.net. As a member of the General Synod, she recently voted for the target of 2030 for carbon neutrality for churches and is part of the General Synod Environmental Group. She is currently studying for a doctorate in Practical Theology, looking at ecological practice and Christian belief. So she knows her stuff, Ruth, and I've heard her speak several times, so I can thoroughly recommend her. Now, Jemima is also someone of real significance and holds a great deal of knowledge herself. I don't have her full spec about her qualifications, but I know she knows what she's talking about, which is just as well as she's our Diocesan Environmental Officer and is leading the Diocesan Working Party that is working towards being carbon neutral by the year 2030. 2030 sounds a long way off, but I've begun to realise that actually it really isn't that far off. We've got a lot of work to do between us all. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ruth, who's going to speak first, and she's going to be addressing the reason of why we should be going carbon neutral. And then Jemima's going to come in with the how, which is really important. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm addressing you today, assuming that you are sympathetic to the idea of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. However, we're going to need advocates in our parishes and in our parish councils and in our congregations. And so some of what I have to say is to enable you to give answers when people say why it's important, and perhaps to deal with some of the objections that you might find coming your way. So I was there at the General Synod in February 2020 when we voted that the Church of England should be carbon neutral by 2030. And it was a bit of a shock, really. We surprised ourselves by our ambition, because the initial motion that went before us said 2045, which we thought was ambitious, but we thought that it was doable. But the General Synod said it wasn't good enough, because the Church of England was to be a leader, and that we knew the urgency of the situation. And so in what came to be somewhat of a shock to the Environmental Working Group, those who steer the project of the Church of England and the environmental work, all of a sudden it was reduced by 15 years to 2030, which already feels very close. And so I need to really explain to you what we agreed and why we agreed it. So the Synod motion said, this Synod, recognising the global climate emergency is a crisis for God's creation and a fundamental justice issue, and following the call of the Anglican Communion, I won't bother with the resolutions, call upon all parts of the Church of England to examine what would be required to receive net zero emissions by 2030 and plan to achieve that target, and submit reports on progress every 3 years, and call on every diocesan synod and every cathedral chapter to address what progress is being made. So it's quite a hefty motion, really. It has quite a lot of oomph. Sometimes the General Synod passes motions and you can ignore them. But this one has got accountability factored in it. So actually it has a lot of heft. Now, we know that the target is a painful and a costly one. None of us who were at the General Synod have got our head in the clouds about the realities of living in the Church of England at the moment. We know that it can be a struggle. We know that there are financial restraints. We know that there are many different things that we want to do. And we know that there are fewer and older people who are actually longing to share the workload, but are actually, bearing the brunt of it, just a few of them. But we didn't do this lightheartedly. We didn't do this for fun. We did it for very good reasons. And I'm assuming that you're all very well aware of the predictions about the future of life on this planet, and the United Nations IPCC saying that we need to keep climate below 1.5 degree of warming, or else it will have absolutely disastrous effects on the ability of the planet to sustain human life and the life of a multitude of other species. And the Church is asking for pretty big behavioural changes from individuals. The Pope Francis has come up with the concept of ecological sin. The Church of England is asking people to make commitments. I think some of you have watched the video about the 5 pledges. And really, the Church as an institution needs to lead the way. And it's a fundamental justice issue. So if anybody says, what has this got to do with mission? It's a fundamental justice issue. I became passionate about ecological mission because I'm passionate about justice. And I wasn't actually even that passionate about justice until I was on the General Synod. And there I got to hear stories from all across the globe, because we hear an Anglican primate address us every single time. And they were talking over and over again about the climate change that was happening in their provinces. And so I have here a picture of Bishop Winston of Polynesia. And if you want to know about climate change from the perspective of the Anglican Communion, Bishop Winston writes extensively on the internet about how climate change is affecting Polynesia. and how he's expecting the Anglican Communion to respond. And you noted that in our motion, it referred back to the Anglican Communion, who'd already said, please, can all churches in the communion be responding with utmost seriousness to the problem of ecological justice. And Archbishop Justin shared that when he meets with the primates, climate change is the number one priority that they have. It's the number one difficulty that they have. So the Synod asked itself, are we members of the Anglican Communion? Yes, of course we are, with the Church of England. And we asked ourselves, are we members of the body of Christ? And of course we are. And so when one part of that body suffers, the whole part, the whole suffers. And so that was the first reason why it was essential for us to vote for it, because of the issues of global justice. All of the ecological issues we face today are justice issues, because the global poor are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So if anybody comes to you and says, why should we do this? When actually it's in the future a little bit, really, for us, we need to be answering back, because the poor are already being affected by it. And they are the ones who've had the least to do with it. They're the ones who consumed the least. They're the ones who've had the least carbon. And I have this vision of this country being a global leader in carbon reduction, because we were the ones who started the Industrial Revolution with all the wonderful benefits that brought, but also all of the problems that brought. Why can't we be leaders in carbon reduction? When actually, if we think about it in terms of carbon debt, all the carbon that any country has ever released, we are second only to the United States in terms of historic carbon debt. So don't let anybody say that we need to wait for China or we need to wait for the third world. We are called to be leaders in this. We have a moral responsibility to be leaders in this. And then there is the thing about, aren't we brilliant already as a country? Our government is always telling us that we're doing great progress on carbon neutrality, on getting closer to carbon neutral. But actually, we export our carbon production. People are always saying China is the one that's producing all the carbon. But why is it producing all the carbon? A lot of the time it's because it's creating products for us that we bring into this country that we use. And yet we don't count the carbon embedded in them in this country's carbon emissions. We count it as China's carbon emissions. It's as if we've exported our carbon production and now we can blame it all on China. But I'm not saying China's perfect. It's a long way from being perfect. But that isn't a reason why we shouldn't be leaders. And so I also think we need to do it because it's a prophetic task. So in this slide, we have Isaiah here. He's a prophet. And we have Greta Thunberg here. And Greta Thunberg is warning of the dangers of climate change. And she is calling the global community to account. But are we prepared to leave it to her? Shouldn't it be the church's job to have a prophetic task and call the nations to repentance and conversion on this? But we can't do that unless we're practicing what we preach. Because we remember Wonga, when the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke out against extortionate lending, but then we found out that the Church of England had invested in Wonga.com. Or Emma Thompson, when she flew from America to take part in Extinction Rebellion demonstrations, but the press tore her to shreds because she'd flown over. In order to be prophetic, you have to have credibility. You have to be practicing what you preach. It's not fair because, of course, you can have ideals that you don't live up to. Of course, you can advocate for a better world whilst not living it. But people don't want to listen, and so they'll take that as an excuse. If we start talking about prophetically about carbon reduction, and carbon and heat are pouring out of our churches, nobody's going to listen to what we say at all. And finally, just a question of why 2030? Why wasn't 2045 time enough? Well, firstly, it's because time is running out. We've been aware of this since the early 1970s, and yet we haven't resolved it. And time is very quickly running out. If we don't get our act together as a global community now, we've got so much catching up to do. We might never be able to catch up. And we might think about it as an overfull bath. If the bath is overfull and you've been pouring 2 taps worth of water in it, really, and then you realise that it's getting overfull and you turn the tap down, it's still going to overflow. The only way to stop it overflowing is to act fast and to really reduce the amount that's going into the bath. And so this is why we chose the target of 2030. I think it would be unpleasant for the Church of England if we didn't reach 2030, or at least have shown that we'd got so far towards it by 2030, which was part of the reason why 2045 was given as the original. We were fairly certain that we could achieve it by then. But why can't the Church of England take a lead? Why can't we be ambitious? Why can't we show the nation and take a moral lead and an ethical lead on this issue, which really is about loving our neighbour as much as it's about loving the earth? So I'm going to hand over to Jemima now. So I have told you why we should be doing it, and Jemima is going to tell you how we're going to get there.
Thank you, Ruth. I have to say, Ruth started off with telling you about General Synod. I sit on the environmental working group that put that motion to General Synod, and was part of the group that decided that we'd be pragmatic and we'd go for 2045 as our target date. So it came as a little bit of a dare I say, a shock, but a bit of a jolt when General Synod voted for 2030. And you can imagine that the past 6 months have been quite busy responding to that 2030 target, because not only were 15 years slashed off our objective, but we were only left with 10 to deliver a net zero ambition. So as Ruth said, I am going to just take you through, I'm just going to share some slides with you and take you through where we, how we can actually, sorry, let's see if we can get this to work first. There we go. How we can actually get to be a zero carbon church, some of the nitty gritty. And what I want to just cover with you now is where are my church's greenhouse gas emissions coming from? What are we counting in the net zero, in the 2030 target? What does net zero carbon mean? And I think there might be some more on here. Let's have a look. Yes, they're coming up. Here we go. How do we measure our carbon emissions? And lastly, how can we actually get to net zero, and what can we actually practically do? So this is much more nitty-gritty practical numbers stuff. So just thinking first of all about where our emissions come from. if, like me, you're not a huge fan of numbers, I thought we'd start off with something a little bit fun and start with a little quiz. So these are 5 areas where your church's carbon emissions might come from. So here we've got our gas central heating, or the heating for the church. In this quiz, it's gas. Got your electricity from the church. It's going to be creating carbon emissions in the generation of your electricity. We've got travel. This group are going off to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage. And we've got things like the manufacture of items, things we might procure like solar panels. And we've got food that we might serve at church as well. So we've got a Sunday roast for 50 people for a year. Maybe they're not having that at church, maybe they're having that in their own homes. So quick quiz, which of these has the highest carbon emissions and which has the lowest? Can you put them in order? Have a little think. Which are you going to go for the highest, and which are you going to go for the lowest? And then I will reveal all. I haven't put you into teams, or I haven't told you what the prize is, but just have a little think which you think might be. I'm going to disappoint by saying there isn't going to be a prize. Shouldn't have mentioned prizes. So starting off with the lowest, the solar panels come in at 225 kilograms of carbon dioxide to manufacture the solar panels. So they, in carbon terms, pay for themselves probably in about a year and a half. They start saving you carbon by generating electricity for your church. Then we've come in with the electricity for the church. Most churches don't use a huge amount of electricity because they're using it for lighting, maybe a little bit in a kitchen if you have a kitchen. Some churches have electric heating. So 5,000 kilograms of electricity, 5,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide for electricity. Next up is this is where it starts getting harder to discern which might be the highest or lowest, is the gas. Now, gas is a really big ticket item for a church, big part of the budget for a church, but also a big part of the carbon budget for a church. Burning a fossil fuel to heat the church creates a lot of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And then we find that food also has a really big carbon emissions, and actually it's a little bit sneaky because this is actually comes just from the beef, because a red meat, beef and lamb, there's a lot of methane emitted in rearing cows and sheep, and also rearing animals takes a lot of feed and is very carbon intensive. And so last up, highest carbon emissions is the pilgrimage to Jerusalem because of the flights. So that just gives you a little bit of some clues as to where the carbon emissions are coming from for your church. But which of these are we actually which of these actually counting in our net zero by 2030 target? So the national church has, as I say, been very busy. We've had a consultation that's gone to Diocese to discuss what should be in and out, what should be part of our 2030 target. And essentially what's been proposed is that, and agreed now, is that it should be the energy use for all our buildings, whether that is churches, voluntary aided schools, clergy houses, and diocesan offices. And so all the energy use, so the gas, electricity, oil, any other fuels. And it should also be travel, the carbon emissions from our travel, so car and aviation miles for clergy and diocesan staff and diocesan volunteers. So this is for the diocese. And it was being agreed that we won't at this stage include a whole raft of other things that are actually what are called scope 3 emissions. What we've got there in energy and travel is scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and it's agreed that we won't include all these other things in the target for 2030. But these are all things that actually we should be thinking about, and we should be trying to reduce our carbon emissions for these items, and that possibly as we get better at measuring these, they might begin to be included if we can raise our ambition over the next 10 years. So we're not including building projects that churches are doing at the moment, because at the moment we don't know how to measure that. We're not including members of the congregations travel to and from church, but we are including clergy travel. We're not including the food that you serve at church, and we're not including the procurement of things like paper. Although of course it's good to reduce those. So those things are currently outside the national definition. So what do we actually mean by net zero? So to get to net zero, we start from our gross carbon emissions. So we take all the carbon emissions from the energy use and all the carbon emissions from our travel, and that gets us to our gross carbon footprint. And then we look at where any of those might be offset or might not be producing carbon emissions. So we take away any electricity that we had got up here that was from renewable sources. So if you have your church electricity from a renewable supply, you take that away. And if you carbon offset your gas, or you contribute to a carbon offsetting scheme that's accredited, you can take that away. And then we get to what we call our net carbon footprint. And that's what we're aiming at for 2030. But the Diocese has done some work, and I've reported on what the carbon emissions are for last year for the Diocese, and we've gathered as much data as we could on this. We're not entirely happy with the data. It's because we need some better ways of gathering this data, and we have some gaps in the data. So you'll notice down here on the key that we have no data for clergy travel at the moment, and we have no data for staff travel, and no data for the emissions from our glebe land. But what we do have is knowledge that our church schools, the voluntary aided schools, create about a quarter of our emissions, and our clergy properties, about 400 houses in across the diocese, create about another quarter of our emissions, and our churches are probably creating about half our emissions, but we only have energy data from about a quarter to a third of our churches. So we've had to extrapolate up on those figures. So they're not perfect at the moment. What about how we can actually measure our own emissions as a church? Well, the National Church have introduced a energy footprinting tool where we can start to measure our energy use. And if you are one of those people who does your parish returns for the church, online parish returns, you will have noticed this new tab on the online parish returns where you can enter your energy data. And if you are not one of those people who do the parish returns, please speak to the person who does, because the last date for entries is the 4th of October, and we desperately want every parish who can to fill in this data, so that for 2019 we have a reasonable baseline for what our churches across the diocese, and for your church, it's really beneficial to know what your carbon emissions were for 2019, because 2020, when we report next year, is going to be a very strange year. It's not going to be very representative, and so it's really helpful to have 2019's figures in. So once you've entered your energy data, you get a lovely little readout like this, which tells you your gross carbon emissions and then your net carbon emissions, and they weather adjust it depending on whether it's been a very cold or a very hot, warm winter. And it tells you also your carbon emissions per square metre, which tells you whether you've got a large building or a small building, will affect that. And it also gives you your carbon emissions per person. So if you have a large congregation, which we'd all love to have, your emissions per person which will go down, which is where we're really aiming at. Lovely warm churches with full of people, so that the carbon emissions per person are really low. So that's the first thing to do in terms of measuring your emissions, but you'll notice that that only picks up on your energy use. And if you want to go a little bit further, you can use this new tool called the 360 Carbon, which is on the Climate Stewards website. And this gives you the opportunity to put in data about the food that you serve at the church, your travel, and the things that you procure, as well as your waste. And it's a bit like buses. All of a sudden, we've had no carbon calculators, and now we have two. So how can we start on our journey to net zero? Well, there is some really good national guidance which has been coming out. The Practical Path to Net Zero is a 2-page document that just tells you the very basics of where you can start. And essentially, its top tip is keep your building well maintained and make good choices when you change anything. But there are other guidance documents like this one, Energy, Economic, Environmental and Efficiency Improvements. There's lots on the Church of England website. We, as in the Diocese of Leeds, have been part of a energy audit analysis project. We've had a master's student working, analysing a couple of hundred energy audits that have taken place across the diocese, and these are some of the results from those energy audits. And here you'll see that the majority, gone too fast. The majority of churches are relatively small and are very good at having very low energy use. Orange is gas, blue is electricity. So the majority of our churches actually will not have too great a challenge in getting to net zero. I can talk about that in a bit more. And then we have our big churches who are creating a lot more emissions, and they are going to have some quite big challenges going forward. But what it also, these analysis of energy audits also indicate is that heating, this orange section here, is the largest slice of our carbon footprint in terms of energy. So electricity is a small chunk, heating's a big chunk, and other things is not as large as heating. So we need to be very mindful about our heating systems and how we're going to tackle those over the next 10 years. And the general direction of travel is electric, whether that is actual electric heating or an air source or a ground source heat pump, which is driven by electricity, because we can generate electricity renewably. It's not the same for oil or gas. So the most frequent recommendations from the energy audits were things like switching to renewable electricity, LED lighting, getting heating controls to optimize your heating system, draft proofing, and putting in efficiency and longevity measures for your heating system. All of these things are relatively simple. I appreciate not completely simple, but relatively simple to do within your church. And then other items, bigger ticket items, are further down the list. So what does an actual what are the key things that a church should be doing if we start having a vision of a zero carbon church? And I'm just going to scoot through these because I'm aware I have been talking for a long time and I want to leave some time for questions. So these are the main sort of principles that we should be doing. Keep your church well maintained, buy renewable, waste less, generate more, and switch to electricity and offset the rest. And then running a zero carbon church, I think I'm going to say, I think I've said most of this, so I'm going to skip very quickly through a few slides. I'm going to whiz through these, so I apologise you won't be able to see these, but I'm going to skip through because I want really just to come to this example of a church in the Birmingham Diocese who have worked to be carbon neutral. And St Michael's have just done some relatively simple things to become a carbon neutral church. They're a small rural church and they've worked to reduce their electricity consumption. They then switched to a renewable electricity supplier. They installed more efficient under-pew heating. So when they came to a decision about changing the heating, they installed a new system of under-pew heating, electric heating. They replaced all their light bulbs with LEDs, and then they thought about where do the rest of our emissions come from, and it was mostly from travel. All their electricity that they're using was accounted for by going to a renewable supplier, and so they calculated the rest of their carbon emissions and they offset that with a carbon offsetting scheme, which was Climate Stewards. So I just wanted to leave it there with an example of a church that has actually become carbon neutral, so that you know that it is possible, even now, 10 years ahead of target, to get to carbon neutrality.
Well, thank you, Jemima and Ruth. Challenging things there, and yeah, really challenging that. So we had one question which from Sylvia, which asked the very obvious question, I guess, but one we're thinking that some churches are already on the ecological journey, but what will be done to start them on it? And I guess quite a few of us here are part of churches, certainly by your introductions, that are quite passionate about this, and the fact that you are even in this session means that this is something you care about. But Jemima and Ruth, what would you recommend? What would be your suggestions to help a church get started on this journey?
Do you want to go first, Jemima? Because my recommendation is ask you to come and visit. Jemima is entirely responsible for me, because Jemima came and addressed our deanery synod when I was the vicar at Kirkington, and that helped me to see how the church could be involved, what the church could do. And she's very inspiring. So a speaker might be the thing, and you might be the speaker, you know, because you were all very passionate at the beginning. So it doesn't necessarily have to be Jemima, because she's hugely busy, but she does have a team of people that can be invited out to advise. The other thing I would say is one tiny thing, one tiny success leads to another. So it doesn't really matter where a church starts, in my opinion. Once they do something, they're pleased with themselves. And in our climate of church at the moment, success is hard to quantify, and actually we don't feel very successful very often in church life sometimes. And so when you succeed at a little eco thing, it gives you a boost to actually try to do some more. And if you are of a competitive bent as a church, then eco church, go for it. Who's going to be the first to be gold? Who's going to be the first to be carbon neutral? It works a treat for my guys, does that?
Thank you, Ruth. I must admit, as a cathedral, we're trying really hard to go for gold. But anyway, Jemima, what would your advice be?
Yeah, I think as a starting point, I would bring it, if you can, to the PCC and say that General Synod have given us this call. How are we going to respond? We're in a climate emergency. What can we do? And then ask the PCC's consent to go away and officially calculate your carbon emissions using one of the calculators. Maybe get a little team together, because it's always better doing these things in 2s and 3s, drawing on each other's support and different skills. And once you've calculated your emissions, or at least had a go at it, start to work out what you could do as a first step. Just think about the fact that actually this is a 10-year project, but what even just one small thing could you do in your plan for the first year?
Yeah, so Sylvia's making quite a few comments here, and I think she makes the comment, which I think is a good one actually, is how do you actually kickstart their motivation? I think once we start getting people like Jemima through the door, and the PCC is talking about it, but the step before that. But actually, Catherine suggests that would making use of the A. Rocher Eco Awards and mini targets motivate churches. Do either Ruth or Jemima have a thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Eco Church Award scheme is fantastic, because it is so positive. You can tick off the things that you are already doing, and I challenge any church not to be doing at least a couple of things. I mean, the fact that if you hold a harvest service every year, you've ticked something, you've got points. You know, that is a fabulous scheme to engage with, and that, you know, that's why, you know, as a diocese we don't bother trying to reinvent anything different from it, because Eco Church provides that.
Thank you.
And I think perhaps if a person is lonely, because I think if there's nobody in the PCC or nobody in the church, then you're probably on a hiding to nothing for now. And you just need to get on praying that somebody will come. But if there's a lonely person in a church who's, you know, seems to be fighting a battle on their own, I think there's quite a bit to be said for deaneries, it's sort of like working together as a deanery. And we're starting to create a lot more networking opportunities for people who are interested across churches to get to know each other.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful suggestion, that deaneries can be a really good way of first of all bringing it to the table, but also encouraging one another. And certainly some churches like yours, Ruth, like the Cathedral, you know, we've got a group of people that are very enthusiastic who could help motivate others. And yes, so John Anderson would like to say something. John, yes.
In 2006, we began this journey, and very briefly, we're a triple certificated eco-congregation, and basically we now have taken all the gas out, so that's removed one big source of emissions. We have built for £1 million the first building on church premises in Britain, which is similar to the standards of a passive house. And I've spent the last 2 months basically making sure it works well, i.e. it gives off no carbon dioxide and uses virtually no electricity, and there is no gas. So if anybody wants to come and see this building, it's called The Fold in Bowden Methodist Church. I'm taking people around quite often because it is the first on church premises in Britain, and we've got it in Bradford. It's really important. But it started with raising consciousness. I set up 2 groups, Vision Group and then a Future Building Group. Good title, I think, really, Future Building Group or Future Building Group. And those 2 groups got people thinking about where we were going to go from 2006 to 2010. And then from 2010, pretty well on, we started raising £1 million. But the importance of the building is not the £1 million. The importance of the building is saying we are not just talking about climate change, we've done something.
Mm. That's really inspiring. Thank you for sharing that, John. I guess that leads to Joe Tarver's question is, what practical steps can we take to insulate a medieval building? Joe is one of our Bradford Cathedral folk, and it's a really interesting question. How do you go about insulating a medieval building? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
It's really challenging. I think one of the things that we need to think about as we go forward in terms of offering people a warm welcome when they come into our church buildings is actually trying to get localized heat, so that we are actually heating the people rather than the whole space, because it is extremely difficult to insulate historic buildings. You really I need one of my DAC colleagues who are historic building specialists, or more historic building specialists here than myself. But really, as I say, we just need to think about, we need to get away from the mindset of heating the whole space.
Right, that's thank you, Jemima. So Sue Penfold asked the intriguing question. Look at the roof space. Is there one? Sue, would you like to elaborate on that?
Sorry, that's a reply to the question of how you... It's a reply to a question. It says the first place to look at is your roof space, if you've got one. And insulate there. If we haven't, then there's a problem. Right,
okay, thank you for explaining that. That's really helpful. Does anybody else, about 5 more minutes of question time, does anybody else have a question or a thought to reflect upon? Can't see any hands up at the moment. Helen, and followed by, oh, I've just lost your name again, but Helen Miller first.
I was just thinking, I've recently got an electric vehicle, and I love it, and I thoroughly recommend them if you get the chance to get one. But I was just thinking about the possibility of having charging points on church premises for when people, I mean, some people can walk to church, can't they? But if you are driving there, not able to get there by public transport. I think somebody mentioned in the talk yesterday about having bike racks on church premises, and obviously that's another great idea. But I just wondered what people's thoughts were on that. I think there probably are some, if you're building new buildings, I think there are some regulations about having to have, depending on the number of car parking spaces, that you do have to have charging points for electric vehicles. But I think John's waving at us, isn't he? He might know because he's just got some experience of that.
Yes, and I noticed Catherine makes a comment of plus provision of space for charging points and active service to the community. Absolutely. I know we have kind of explored a little bit of that at the Cathedral. Our challenge is actual space for people to do that. But yes, absolutely. John, would you like to come back on that one?
Yes, two things. One, far infrared heating, which we've put in all over Belden Methodist Church, does only heat you and the fluids in you, not the air above you. Secondly, car charging points, I found that we could get 3 put in at Belden Methodist Church free. I don't know whether that scheme's now finished, but we've got 3 car charging points. The only problem is nobody is using them. But let nobody say to me, what do you put them in for? Nobody's using them, because that's obviously a daft thing to say. But we put them in, and at the moment we're carrying the cost. Since the cost is 0 of the electricity, that doesn't matter. But I do think they ought to go in any thing you do, but there are ways of getting them cheaply or free.
Thank you. That's a very helpful comment, John. I mean, I know that car manufacturers are having to move towards getting all their vehicles to that point. So eventually, I think you will have customers for your points, and but it's important, I think. Was that through the council that put those in for free?
The government had a scheme, because I've got one in my garage as well. All I haven't got is an electric car to go with it. The government had a scheme first. I'm not sure now whose scheme it is.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Paul Garrett, did you have your hand up to ask a question?
Well, yes. In Kent, we've got huge warehouses, huge greenhouses for growing tomatoes and things like that in Thanet. And there is a question mark over that. I wondered if it's extending it from church property, but there you are. And also water. Is there a possibility of using canals and things like that?
In what respect, Paul?
Transport, bulk transport, as well as for charging points for canal boat use, leisure time, which we might well have more of now.
Yes, some really interesting points. I mean, Jemima, is there something that are you aware of any of those sort of schemes?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, there are talks, aren't there, about using our canals for bulk transport more than we currently are, and the electrification of narrowboats would be fantastic, because they are very polluting diesel generated at the moment. So electric charging on our canals would be fantastic. Just going back to church electric charging points, I mean, I would love to see our churches, as somebody put in the chat box, being a real witness and giving service to our communities by every church that can having at least one charging point, for a couple of reasons, really. In rural areas where people want to go out and visit, if you have an electric vehicle, you need somewhere to charge. So actually for our rural areas, for their tourism, electric charging is going to start being quite important as more people move to electric, and facilitating that. And in urban areas, many of our communities don't have off-street parking where they can charge, have their own charging point and charge. But if the church round the corner has 3 or 4 bays where you can charge, you could actually just park your car up overnight and use the church car parking, which we wouldn't be using overnight, and would be a blessing to our neighbours. So I think it's something that every church should be should consider. It is part of the offer that the Green Journey scheme that the Diocese collaborates in. That's our energy procurement scheme. You can go to the Green Journey and they will explore the possibility of car charging installation for you with a funding model which you can choose to go with or not, but they could give you a quote.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'm just thinking, you know, how awesome would that be if every single church in the land everybody went to, knowing that they could get recharged for their car, and hopefully while they're waiting get recharged spiritually as well. I mean, there's some exciting prospects there. We've just about come to the end of our time, and it's been challenging and informative. Thank you, Ruth and Jemima. You're both very inspiring, but also real advocates. And to the rest of you here, I know many of you have been clearly heavily part of this journey already. And one of the things that we've discovered here at the Cathedral is actually there is very much a sense of community. We learn from each other. I love the part that Ruth made the comment of actually little baby steps. You soon begin to get some successes, and that encourages to go forward. And that's a really good way to begin if you know of a church that hasn't begun, or a community centre. So actually being able to take those steps and encourage each other. It's not just about the Church of England, it's about all faiths, all denominations, and we can encourage and inspire each other. So a really big thank you to both of you. Just to give a little bit of a plug here, if you haven't seen it on our website already, Jemima oversaw the 10 pledges to help the planet. So 10 pledges that people have committed to, and that's a really lovely little film to give you a bit of encouragement. And also part of the God's Green Fingers. But Ruth, I'm really delighted to say we're going to see 2 more times. She's going to be preaching at the Cathedral's Harvest Festival service at 10:30 on Sunday morning. We don't expect you all to turn up at the Cathedral. The beauty of technology is that is also live streamed, so you can hear Rev Ruth preaching. And also tomorrow at 6 p.m. there is a film going out live, and it's to do with Bible and ecology. So if you want to find out more about Bible ecology, you can also contact Ruth directly, or go onto the God's Green Fingers website, or speak to Jemima and book to go onto that. And I think I'm just looking for my notes where I wrote it down. I believe the next course that Ruth is running on Bible and ecology starts on the 4th of November. Have I got that right, Ruth? 3rd of November, thank you. And I think that sounds like a really good thing to do. So just to conclude, big thank you to everyone for being here. It's just brilliant that you have joined us this evening. Do keep an eye on our website for all the other things that are happening tomorrow and on Sunday. And if you want to see this again, be reminded of the talks, that those 2 will appear on our website and on social media. So once again, huge thank you to you all, and I wish you a blessed evening.
Thank you.
Enthusiasm to continue with climate change. So thank you, everybody, and our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy.